Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Arena Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. What about rape? What about incest? What about when a mother's life or health are at risk? These are the hardest questions in the abortion debate. They're tragic, emotionally charged, and frequently used to challenge the pro-life position. But are these cases as common as people think? And when they do happen, how should medicine and ethics respond? My guest today is Father Tadeusz Pacholczyk, a priest and scientist who has spent decades helping physicians and families navigate exactly these kinds of dilemmas. He earned his PhD in neuroscience from Yale, completed postdoctoral work at Harvard, and today serves as Senior Ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, advising on some of the most complex medical decisions doctors and families face. In this conversation, we explore the real-world cases people bring to bioethicists, why the rarest scenarios often dominate public debate, and how careful ethical reasoning helps us navigate situations where both compassion and truth are urgently needed. Father Tad, welcome to Bioethics Babe.
Good morning, Arena. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be able to join you.
Yes, thank you. So you hold degrees in philosophy, biochemistry, molecular cell biology, and chemistry, and later earned a PhD in neuroscience from Yale, did postdoctoral work at Harvard before becoming a priest and a bioethicist. Can you tell us about that journey? What drew you from neuroscience into the priesthood and ultimately into the field of bioethics?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people notice that biographical information and they're like, yeah, what is it that made you switch out of neuroscience into bioethics? In other words, the assumption is that I was doing that kind of research, doing molecular biology, cloning genes and so on, which is what I was doing as a graduate student, and postdoctoral work. I was working in a protein chemistry lab and doing some fairly sophisticated molecular analysis. And so they're like, well, gee, it seems like that's a big step there. That's a big jump to go from that into, becoming a priest and then into bioethics. And the assumption is that, some light bulb must have gone off over your head, or some revelation. And it was actually, interestingly, the reverse, that I realized that I was being called to be a priest fairly early, in my late teens, but at the same time that I realized that, I realized, oh my goodness, I have to study science, and I have to be able to bring science into the priesthood. And I wasn't sure why. I had gotten into some interesting discussions with one of my philosophy professors in a class that I took. He was a brilliant thinker, but he and I kind of came to a certain impasse, and I was convinced that, he had not correctly sort of summarized and understood the relationship between science and religion. And so this was an important trigger for me to then say to myself, well, I've got to, science is an interesting thing in the sense that it is one of the authoritative languages of our time. If you're a physician, if you're a researcher, if you're a scientist by training, even a physicist, whatever, there's automatically, I would say, accorded to you a certain authority in virtue of that. So I knew that. I understood that this was culturally hugely important, and I also understood that science was a language of its own, like Greek, like Russian, like any other language, has its syntax. It's pretty complicated language, actually. And also that science has become very, very siloed. Everybody has a little silo that they occupy. They specialize to a very high degree. And so I thought, well, I want to be able to speak that language. But at the same time, of course, it's true that religion and faith is a super important language for us as humans as well. And so getting these two together in some fashion to remind people of the compatibility when they've sort of imbibed a false message that they're inherently incompatible, that there's tension that cannot be resolved. This I've sensed early was something I needed to do. So I pursued those degrees that you mentioned as an undergraduate at the University of Arizona. My dad was a astrophysicist. He was a professor at the university. So I had the blessing of being able to take courses at the university for $100 per semester. So,
Wow.
I got a great education for next to nothing, thanks be to God. And so I studied those undergraduate degrees, and when I finished, then I realized, okay, I need to really know the language of science. You've got to descend into the particulars. So I went ahead and planned for graduate school, and I also realized that I was called to be a priest, so I wanted to start out doing some theology and additional philosophical studies. And I did that at a seminary in Connecticut where it was possible to go kind of as an unsponsored student and study and just pay for the philosophy and the theology. So I did that. And as I was doing that, then I also applied to graduate schools that were nearby and was accepted at the various schools that I applied to. One of them was Yale, so I decided, all right, well, I'll go to that one and do my graduate work there. And ended up, getting into very interesting line of research, cloning genes that are expressed in the brain for what are called neurotransmitter transporters, which are important in basically canceling signals between nerves in the brain. So it was very foundational type of research. It gave me a lot of insight into, the molecular basis of various diseases, and gave me, of course, a fluency with the medical literature itself, which became immediately useful when I transitioned only a couple of years later in Rome when I was studying to become a priest, and I transitioned into studies in bioethics. I was able to read a lot of the direct scientific literature, especially in those days on the important topic of embryonic stem cell research. And so as soon as I was ordained and came back to the US, people were asking me, hey, can you give a talk on this new area, this hot new area that everybody's talking about, embryonic stem cells? I said, yeah, sure. I said, I've been following the literature. And so that sort of took off on its own impetus, and I was soon speaking on that topic all over the country and actually in other countries as well. And so that's kind of how the two came together. And, I was ordained in 1999 and had some opportunities to encounter the work of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and had a meal at one point with Dr. John Haas, our former president, and he said, hey, would you ever consider working for the National Catholic Bioethics Center? And I said, well, sure, but you got to get my bishop's permission because I can't do anything unless he says yes. So Dr. Haas said, oh, no problem. And Dr. Haas knows a lot of the bishops personally. It's amazing. He goes way back with some of them. And so anyway, one thing followed another, and I joined the Bioethics Center where I've been for more than 20 years. And so that's kind of the journey in a nutshell, putting it into, its essential outlines. And it's been great work. And as you can imagine, you're doing this podcast and interviewing a lot of people on interesting topics. And I know you've studied, bioethics yourself. No 2 days are ever the same. That's part of the pleasure of this type of work. New controversies coming at you all the time. The other day I was in Oregon speaking on three-parent embryos and embryo modeling models, where you make synthetic human embryos and many other approaches to generating facsimiles or close copies of human embryos. And so that stuff is very cutting edge, and again, no 2 days are ever the same. You just realize the controversies are coming at us. And as we've just sort of gone through a certain period in time where the whole transgender issue was front and center, we were dealing with that extensively at the Bioethics Center, and I would speak on that issue a great deal as well. So the controversies change, whether it's embryonic stem cells or transgenderism or other cutting-edge issues. It's always quite interesting, I must say.
Yes, and you're the prime example of what somebody can do with both faith and reason, right? Faith and science are compatible, and you're showing that just in what you've studied and how you've applied it to these very interesting and difficult cases, bioethical situations. And I would love to have you back too for a discussion about embryo modeling and three-parent embryos. But the topic at hand today is the hard cases, as I mentioned earlier. And before we jump into that specifically, obviously, as you mentioned, you serve as Senior Ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and you regularly advise people on very difficult medical decisions. What kinds of medical and ethical questions are people bringing to you most often?
I would say that probably when we review the types of consultations that we get, there's going to be a certain preponderance of end-of-life cases where people have a mom or a dad who's dying and they're wondering, do we need to keep them on the ventilator now? Can we turn off the ventilator? Is it, going to be immoral to turn off the ventilator? And, what about this particular treatment and benefits and burdens? And a lot of questions along those lines. And many times that's because they'll realize they don't have much background themselves, and they'll have maybe brothers and sisters who there are disagreements. Oh, just let mom go kind of thing. We don't need to do anything. And so there's a lot of troubling family dynamics that can bubble up in those end-of-life scenarios. And we sometimes get pulled into that, sideways, as it were, as we're seeking to provide assistance, guidance, and consultation to people. And you mentioned to medical people that we provide, to physicians, nurses, and others, but also worth mentioning that our consultation service, which is free, is used a lot by priests and even bishops. And we do a lot of work with bishops. And so these questions that come up can be very challenging. They can be very detail dependent. So you'll have to know a lot of detail. And I think it's also important, Arena, to emphasize to people when it comes to what we do at the Bioethics Center in terms of providing consultations. I think sometimes people think, well, I just sort of write up my question and submit it to the NCBC and they'll give me the answer. And it's like, well, no, that's not exactly how it works. What we do is we try to partly accompany you and provide you with certain principles that will be useful to guide you. But you're the person, for example, whose bedside as your mom is dying. You're right there. You know what's actually, you've been talking to the doctors, to the nurses. You may even be the healthcare proxy, the person making the actual decisions because your mom is now unconscious. And so we just assist you to make the best decision that you can, hopefully an ethically responsible decision as well. But we don't just sort of type out the answer for you. We assist you as you navigate what can be sometimes challenging, turbulent waters as your loved one is getting more sick.
And
So,
how can someone, any of our listeners who are listening in, if they find themselves in that situation where they have a difficult ethical medical question, how can they find information? How can they call in to speak with an ethicist?
yeah, so the best way is for them to start on our website, which is ncbcenter.org. And you can see that kind of on my screen behind me, ncbcenter.org. And there's a drop-down menu for consultations. And if you open that, it'll open up a window, and you can either send us a message, and we'll get back to you, or you can also call. And if you call, you'll be put into voicemail, and you leave your message, and whichever ethicist is on duty that day will then, return the call, get back to you, and follow up with you. So, and if you happen to be a little old-fashioned like we still are, and you use a fax machine, most people hardly even remember what those are. We do have a fax number, and you can reach us that way as well. And then we'll get back to you.
That's wonderful. What a wonderful service to people and to the church as well. You said that bishops and priests also call in with these questions. Besides the end of life issues, what are the hardest real world cases people call into the National Catholic Bioethics Center in addition to the end of life questions?
Well, I don't know. I mean, hardest, it's sort of, that's a little bit of a subjective judgment perhaps on our part to say what are the hardest ones for people to experience. Sometimes, we have people struggling with infertility, and they want to know what's allowable here. And sometimes you'll have husband and wife who have maybe navigated a difficult pregnancy, and they'll say, gee, when our first baby was born, it was a really difficult birth, really. We almost lost my wife. So won't the church allow us to use contraception if the doctors are telling us there's another chance that if you get pregnant again, it may also be a difficult pregnancy? So, but that's one case among many that we receive. So your question about what's the hardest one, I mean, those are all hard cases. Everyone is hard, and everyone that the individual couple or the individual person is going through, it feels hard. And that's probably why they're reaching out to us, to get some assistance, because they're not sure how to proceed in very, very sensitive areas. And they do want to be faithful. This is the beautiful part. They want to be faithful to the Lord and His church. This matters to them to get it right. So what a blessing that is. And I'd say when you have people like that, it's always a pleasure to work with them and consult with them. You realize their heart is in the right place. They do want to do the right thing as much as they can. They just don't know sometimes the details of how they should proceed.
Mm-hmm. So now let's dive into the questions at hand, the hard cases surrounding the abortion debate. So many people assume that abortion debate deals only with abstract principles. But in rare cases, people actually do face tragic situations. Rape and incest together account for about 1 to 1.5% of abortions, and threats to the mother's life or health are well under 1%. Yet these cases dominate the debate. Why do the rarest cases so often drive the entire conversation?
Well, I think one could even say that those rare cases have been purposefully and strategically utilized to open. It's like, you try to find some tiny little exception that you can get people to agree to it. Then that little exception, you then drive the truck through it, as they say. And of course, exceptions don't make for good moral reasoning or for good legal development of law either. But I think that this provides a kind of powerful lever arm to almost use in a semi-weaponized way to get people to agree, oh, well, therefore we have to have some abortions, and therefore we have to, as a society, if we're going to be compassionate, that's the phrase, then we're going to have to allow for cases, difficult cases like the ones you mentioned, to sort of push the whole enterprise forward and legalize it. And in virtually every country that has had legalized abortion, the way it became legal was through a kind of heavy messaging around specifically the cases that you mentioned, rape and incest, and other life of the mother cases, so that your average person who hadn't really had the opportunity to delve into this or think it through in a critical and careful and rational manner was sort of their heartstrings were pulled. And in virtue of that, a lot of times I think, Irina, we do permit emotion to substitute for thinking carefully about ethics. And that's really unfortunate, and that's something that all of us as believers need to work on for ourselves, but for the people around us as well, to make sure we don't substitute a kind of emotionalism, as tempting as that can be. And, oh, my feelings tell me that the ethics here are this. And, my sentiments are like this, and therefore that's the final word. Whatever I feel, as Americans, for some reason, I think we've fallen into that trap many times. And, even as Catholics, maybe not to go too far sideways, but if you'll let me just at least make a little parallel example. One thing for me as a priest that I always find unfortunate and kind of distressing is maybe somebody has died and I'm maybe doing the funeral, and you'll bump into family members who'll say about the person who died, oh, he's in a better place, and oh, he's with the angels. We call it the instant canonization. These people are declared saints. Now, part of this is, well, maybe they want to make someone else in the family feel better about the loss that has happened. But it's like, well, what kind of data do you have to conclude that this person is in a better place, or that they're with the angels, or they say, oh, well, they've become a little angel, when they died, kind of thing again. And so it's, well, because I will it, because I want to say it, that makes it true. And I think a lot of times we approach ethics with this same kind of general, I would call it even, sloppiness. You can have your ethics and I can have my ethics. And we're all going to just have to agree to disagree. And I'm like, well, we've already seen that kind of thinking is bankrupt. We had a great civil war. You can't say that you think slavery is okay and I think slavery is not okay. And we're just going to go along and get along. We fought a terrible, awful, brutal civil war with so many deaths. It doesn't work. And the same is true when we discuss other important controversies, one being the one you and I are looking at, namely abortion, that this involves some very, very high priority goods that simply cannot be funneled into that kind of shallow analysis of sentiments and feelings. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't real emotions that are attached to these issues. And, when a young woman gets pregnant unexpectedly, it can be just totally turn her life upside down, and she is experiencing all kinds of strong emotions and complications and regrets, and realization that she may not be able to pursue a career or finish her studies at school if she has to carry the baby, and so on and so forth. It's an emotional reality. There's no denying that, but at the same time, we have to be able to sort through some very, very powerful feelings that may be accompanying to ask, well, what really is going on here? What are the responsibilities that accrue to me as a new mother here, or to me as a new dad unexpectedly here in this situation of an unexpected pregnancy? And those become the real core questions to get them right, because if you don't get them right, people are hurt and traumatized in ways that track with them for years, decades, and really for the rest of their lives. And as they're getting older and approaching death themselves, there can be some very real regrets over you remember that beautiful phrase in the scriptures about, Lord, remember not the sins of my youth. And we all, I think, pray to be in that abundant flow of God's mercy. It's so critical that we do that. And but at the same time, to the extent that we can avoid layering trauma upon trauma, and the case you're mentioning of rape, clearly the rape is a horrible trauma, unbelievable trauma for anybody to have to to go through. But then the answer becomes, all right, so you've got that one trauma. Now, what does society recommend as a response, as a caring and loving, supposedly, response? The answer is, well, how about another trauma? You just had one. Here's another one. Let's give you an abortion. Let's take away the life of your little baby who's growing inside you. And that should solve all your problems. It's like, wait a minute. One trauma as an answer to another makes absolutely no sense at all, and only compounds the gravity of what originally happened, and is really a false solution at the end of the day as well. So I think the beauty of kind of cogent and reasonable moral analysis is that you say, all right, what's really got to be considered? Well, you have several individuals who are affected by what the rapist did. One is the mom, the woman. The other is the child that she's now carrying, assuming that there was a pregnancy that followed. That child is profoundly affected. And if that child is born, later, as one would hope that he or she would be, this will require working through some real processing about who the dad was and what happened at the origin of their being. But having a proper sense of our own origins is important. It's important to get it right. And I think a lot of people struggle with a sense of identity as they're growing up and trying to know, who they are. And this will be one piece that will be part of the puzzle that has to be processed with integrity, truthfulness, and the temptation to sort of try to swish the problem away by offering abortion is to do a grave injustice both to mom and to that child. And it's interesting that when you do follow-up research on women who have suffered sexual assaults, and you ask them, assuming that they carried the pregnancy to term, and you ask them, do you regret that you didn't get an abortion, or that somebody didn't offer you an abortion? The answer is very, very frequently, oh no. Now that the child is born and they're raising the child and they understand, yes, it's been a very difficult journey, but it's like, oh no, I can't envision the world without my child now that I see him or her. And so again, I think this idea that it's going to just clean up everything is an oversimplification. And it's also interesting to look at the children who were born from sexual assaults, from rape, and some of them are remarkably, traveling around and speaking and saying, well, would it have been right for me to have been punished for the sins of my dad against my mother? I say, no, that wouldn't be fair. And I know you've probably heard the name Rebecca Kissling. She's a lawyer, and I met her in France one time. She and I were both speaking at the same event, and I was very impressed with her story and the kind of way she was arguing so sensibly that this is a false answer. This is a crock. This is a lie to tell people that this is going to solve, and it's terrible for the children, of course, who are caught in this terrible situation. They deserve better, as does the mother. They deserve support, they deserve care, and the opportunity as unique individuals with unique gifts, the children to grow up and to come to a kind of healthy self-acceptance.
She does have an incredible story. Before we delve deeper into the case of rape itself, as you already mentioned, obviously all of these that we're talking about today are incredibly tragic situations. And as you mentioned too, the public seems to be confused medically and ethically, probably because they're so emotionally charged, these situations, right? So you already mentioned this, but maybe it would be better to just have a clear framework before we dive in deeper. How is bioethics different? And when you think about these hard questions from a bioethical perspective, How is that different from intuition or feeling or even political slogans when approaching these cases?
Well, I would say that you always have objective questions and issues that are sort of the foundation. And the hope would be that my emotions and your emotions would be informed by these objective considerations. And the hope would be that even the political slogans that you're mentioning would be informed by these principled issues. And so often they're not. And similarly, the hope would be that all of our laws, in order to be just laws, would be built upon a solid foundation of objective considerations. So, I mean, in situations where you have complex pregnancies or situations involving rape or incest, to recognize we always have two individuals, at least, who are involved in that pregnancy, assuming there aren't twins or triplets, and the mother and the child, each of whom deserve attention, medical care, deserve our love, deserve our compassion. So that's a very kind of principled position right up front, that you always have two patients, not just one. Because a lot of times we talk around the baby and, oh, the only thing that matters is the mom, whatever she wants. And the rest of it we can abstract from it and almost pretend it's not even there. But that's a failure in ethical thinking. That's a failure in logical rigor. And it's a failure to correctly assess what the objective goods are.
Mm-hmm. And many people frame the question when rape is at hand. The question becomes, quote unquote, why should a woman be forced to carry her attacker's child? What's wrong with that way the question is framed? And what would you say in response to it?
Well, I would say forced to carry her attacker's child. I would say that's sort of stepping away from another consideration, which is, well, in the aftermath of the rape, there may be interventions that can be offered that would prevent the rapist's sperm from reaching the woman's eggs. And now you can stop and think about that and say, all right, well, that makes sense. It's not like, in virtue of the man forcing himself onto the woman, that thereby the woman has an obligation to offer up her eggs so they get fertilized and so that new life is created. No, that's not true at all. She's allowed to defend herself from what is really a form of extension of the original violence, the attack by his sperm. And so if she had a drug that would prevent her ovaries from releasing eggs so that the attacker's sperm could get to it, prevent that, that would be legitimate. But that's very different, because at that point, you're talking about eggs, and a woman's eggs are not human beings. They are not new members of the species. But once the sperm has reached the egg and you have created new life, a new individual, a child of that mother and a child of that man as well, the situation is now a different situation. And as soon as that happens, it's not a matter of forcing mom to become a mom. She's already a mom. This has already happened. And now the question becomes, all right, she's a mom. What are her duties here towards her own offspring? And this is her offspring. Granted, she didn't, consent to the sexual intercourse that resulted in the conception, but it's still objectively her child, her offspring, her baby. And she is the mom to that baby, and that's very, very important. Those maternal aspects must be respected and safeguarded, and she will hopefully find the kind of outside support that will enable her to be and become a better and better mom to that child as the child grows within her and eventually, hopefully, comes to see the light of day. So it's not
Yes.
forcing in that sense. It's that she's already a mom. This has already transpired. And now you're saying, all right, instead of being a mom, maybe she could agree to cooperate in the killing of her offspring, in the ending of the life. And that's like, no, that would not be a good example of exercising maternal stewardship, being a good mom.
Right. And how does bioethics distinguish between the injustice done to the mother, because obviously there was an injustice done to the mother, and the moral status of the preborn child?
Um, there was an injustice done, as I said earlier, to both of them by, the fact that the child had to come into the world this way on account of a sin of the father against the mother. That's an injustice against both mom and baby. So I think we have to always acknowledge that injustice. We can't sort of avoid that. And and then the second part of your question was about the child itself. What was it?
That basically, obviously, and as you clarified, it is an injustice against both the mother and the child. But how does bioethics distinguish between those injustices and the moral status of that preborn child?
So the moral status is something that is going to lean very heavily upon foundational biology and the fact that humans give rise to other humans. And this is, the law of biogenesis, we call it. And so we can't somehow sideline the humanity of the early embryo, even the embryo that's created in rape, because he or she is brother and sister to all of us and came into the world, because of that law of biogenesis through the very approaches and mechanisms set in motion at the very beginning when man and woman were created by God. And so just recognizing that the status of the embryo is he or she is one of us, the child in the womb may not look super familiar. When I was giving a talk a few days ago in Portland, Oregon, I had a room full of a couple hundred people, and I said, how many of you have ever seen yourself with your own eyes a human embryo? And I think maybe one hand in the whole room went up. And I said, well, there you have it. We're not supposed to see the human embryo for the most part because the proper setting for the embryo is within the protective care of his or her mom until such time as he or she is born. And then we all get used to it. We all have familiarity with babies, right? Because we've all seen babies, but we haven't seen embryos. And I said, there's that thought experiment that people sometimes throw around right and left. They'll say, well, look, I'm going to give you this thought experiment. If I had a little newborn baby in one arm and I had a petri dish with an embryo in the other, and I told you that I was going to throw one of the two off the cliff, which one would you choose? I bet you anything you would choose to have me throw the embryo in the petri dish rather than the newborn baby. And now, again, this is a classic experiment of playing off of a kind of raw emotionalism, and not only emotionalism, but what is it that we're familiar with? We've seen babies, lots of babies. We've all held babies. It's a wonderful blessing, but we haven't seen embryos. So we sort of go through a mental disconnect. We fail to see that the moral status that you're asking about flows from the fact that each and every single one of us exists in a material continuity with the little embryo that we once were, that tiny little creature that we once were. We're sort of all, I like to say, we're all overgrown embryos, bottom line. And as a former embryo myself, I do have strong opinions about how embryos ought to be treated. So the objective status there requires some reflection, requires some integrity to make sure that you're not letting other side considerations to obscure the fundamental lines of obligation made clear by bioethics or by ethics more broadly.
Absolutely. But some argue that abortion in a case of rape or incest is justified because pregnancy itself becomes, quote unquote, part of the trauma. How do bioethicists think about healing versus compounding violence?
So I think here the question becomes, is it true or not that the woman, as she experiences the pregnancy, may be reminded of the rape, of the sexual assault? And the answer is certainly. That may sometimes indeed be the case. As she sees her belly getting larger and the child growing within, there indeed may be recall. And in some sense, then that can be called something like a form of traumatization. But it's important to understand that that is not the fault of the child doing what the child does, which is he's growing in place or she's growing in place. It's the fact that there was a terrible injustice done to the woman that has scarred her psyche, and she is deserving of appropriate support and treatment and therapy and accompaniment and love from people around her to help her get through what's clearly a very, very hard place that she finds herself in. So the ethics here would say, don't misidentify and target an innocent bystander, which is what the baby is. The innocent bystander fact here is something anybody can see. The baby has no responsibility whatsoever in this case and should not be used as a surrogate target or a target put onto his or her back, a surrogate for the rapist. What instead should happen is the rapist must be brought to justice and the full extent of the law, powers of the law be brought to bear so that justice, to the extent that it can be, is pursued for that act that he perpetrated. So that's, I think, how we need, and in ethics and bioethics, we clarify those lines by not allowing for a misidentification of who's at fault, as if the baby was somehow at fault when the baby is not.
Absolutely, and I think you aptly named that what needed to be said about obviously the rapist should be brought to justice, and both the mom and the baby are victims in the situation. You had mentioned earlier that there are medical interventions allowed immediately after rape to prevent pregnancy, and as you mentioned, there's a difference between preventing pregnancy, preventing the fertilization from taking place, than what happens after fertilization takes place, because anything after fertilization takes place would be an abortion, but preventing fertilization, you just have a sperm and an egg. So what's that protocol look like specifically to try to prevent the egg and the sperm from meeting?
So if a woman has been sexually assaulted and she goes to an emergency room, it's important first that they do their best to get some kind of assessment of her menstrual history and to find out, whether she has, what is the likelihood that she has already ovulated or released an egg. And another way that this can be done with a more clinical side is through a urinalysis that looks for LH, luteinizing hormone. And if her LH level can be shown to have surged, then it is likely that the egg was released already, and there is no way to actually stop that, or if it wasn't released already, it is in the process of being released. And therefore, if you were to take, for example, something like the morning after pill Plan B, which has strong anovulatory effects, it still would not be able to stop this release, and therefore, it wouldn't make sense to do it, because one of the other effects of taking Plan B is that it thins the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. So then what if you did take Plan B and there were ovulation and the rapist's sperm met the egg, and you had a new life, new human being who's now traveling down the fallopian tube, slowly making his or her way towards the uterus, but you've made the uterus inhospitable to the arrival of that baby by the use of Plan B, thinning out the endometrium, then you would be basically causing an abortion. Mm-hmm. And this would be, again, morally unacceptable. So the real issue here is when you use agents in sexual assault settings, you want to offer things like the possibility of emergency contraception to contracept, to prevent the sperm from reaching the egg, because the woman is not obligated to receive the sperm and offer up her eggs. But you don't want this to turn into an emergency abortion, as it were. Then you've crossed a fundamental moral line. So she's entitled to protect herself from the attacker's sperm, yes, and there will be some required, testing and so on to be able to do that. And I think you're familiar with the ethical and religious directives from the Catholic bishops. They actually have one of their directives, number 36, that deals directly with this question. And they emphasize that the woman who has undergone sexual assault, that she really does deserve compassionate and understanding care and psychological support, spiritual support, etc. Very, very important. But then it speaks also about that she should be able to defend herself against a potential conception. Defend herself against a potential conception. That's good language. And so they specifically, the bishops mention in directive number 36, that you can take medications that would affect, as we've just been discussing, ovulation or the release of an egg, but also if you had a drug that affected sperm capacitation, making sperm ready and able to fertilize, if you could inhibit that process, or some other drug that would directly affect the possibility of fertilization, that will be fine. But you cannot take a drug that's going to bring about the removal of an embryo that may have already implanted into her uterus, or that's going to destroy that little baby that's growing, or otherwise interfere with the implantation of that arriving embryo as it's coming down the fallopian tube. If you do that, then you're talking about an abortifacient effect, and that is not ethically defensible.
Yes, and to clarify, what we're talking about here are situations like rape and incest, where you're trying to suppress ovulation or stop the sperm from fertilizing the egg. Obviously, in any other situation, these would be contraceptive measures that would not be acceptable, except in a situation like this where there is a case of rape or incest.
That's correct. That, in other words, in marriage, contraception will never be morally permissible. This involves a decision to engage freely in the act of sexual communion with your spouse, and at the same time employing directly countermeasures to prevent the act from doing precisely that which the act is ordered and disposed to doing, which is bringing forth the gift, the beautiful gift and blessing of new life. So this involves a contradictory behavior in marriage when one turns to contraception. I think a parallel example, you can see that the sexual act in marriage between spouses is ordered towards this. That's what we call its telos, its end-directedness. So what about, just to take another example, what about when we eat? What is the end-directedness of our eating? Well, it helps to nourish us, right? Gives us nutrients so we can grow and become stronger and carry out many other functions that we need to do as humans. Well, what about if you choose bulimia? You decide to eat and then, or to binge and purge and force yourself to vomit up that which you just swallowed. This is, again, using countermeasures against the very act that you're engaged in, freely engaged in. And this is a disordered kind of a choice to do this. Contraception is similarly disordered, doing and counteracting the very act itself, the human act that has an end and a purpose for which we engage in it. And makes no sense to adopt those kinds of contradictory postures.
Exactly. And it goes without say, but maybe we should also say that sexual intercourse outside of marriage and contraception are not permissible. The sexual act should be within the marriage and also open to life. So just to mention that, because obviously if people hear, well, I can't contracept in marriage. Well, you shouldn't be engaging in the sexual act outside of marriage, and therefore not contracepting outside of marriage at all. Well, not contracepting at all, whether inside or outside, because you shouldn't be engaging.
I like the phrase, the marital act. In other words, we're never permitted to engage in the marital act unless we are married. And if we're not married, then this is something completely outside our proper purview, and we are doing something wrong by engaging the sexual faculties in that set of circumstances. That's always the case. So, contraceptive interventions don't fit there either, because the real issue is we should not be pursuing sexual commerce with another person that we're not married to.
Absolutely. Now, let's pivot to incest. We discussed it briefly, but incest cases are also often used rhetorically in the abortion debate. Are the ethical principles actually different, whether a woman gets pregnant by incest or by rape, or are people responding to the emotional weight of the situation in both cases?
Well, certainly they are responding to the emotionally charged reality in front of them. And incest oftentimes will be a kind of ongoing, almost chronic situation that can go on for months or years or longer, and so doesn't find suitable opportunities for resolution until a young woman grows up and has to process this, sometimes with the assistance of counselors and others whom she trusts, that she can share the burden of the secret that she's been under the weight of for all this time. So yeah, there's a lot of emotional baggage that's part of this. And if there's a pregnancy that results from the incest, then you're right back to the same kinds of considerations that we discussed in the first part, that there's a child here who does not deserve to have his or her life extinguished in the name of the wrong that was committed by the young woman's father in perpetrating the incest. And so she needs to be removed from harm's way. And that's sometimes difficult to do in the family where this has become a pattern of wrongful behavior. But yet it's so important that those who are involved with social services and those maybe at school who find out about this, that they take appropriate steps to be sure that the young woman is placed in a safer environment in some fashion, out of harm's way. And the details of that will have to be worked out on a case-by-case situation, but otherwise it's a failure, and offering an abortion in these conditions is also a failure, because even with an abortion, the abuse may be able to still continue post-abortion. And this is one of the tragedies that surrounds the whole expansion of availability of the abortion pill, that you can have men who are abusing women in various ways, whether it's sexual assault or incest, and then getting pills and sort of forcing the young women to ingest these pills because they don't want them to carry a pregnancy. And this results in a very unfair situation where, again, there's further victimization, as we said earlier, and there's a failure to care, really, for both of the individuals who are part of that pregnancy, mom and her child.
Absolutely. And I would say that both rape and incest are sexual assaults, and that those moms and babies are both the victims, as you mentioned. So how should society think about the responsibility of protecting both victims, the mother and the preborn child?
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of this, that we can't abstract from both of them needing our support and care. And so for the woman to be able to gestate and carry the pregnancy, for the mom to be able to do that, we have to ask ourselves, how do we support her? Do we need to move her to a different location, and work with maybe other family members who are not connected to what happened? Are there other grandparents, others that might be able to assist? It's going to be a case-by-case, I think, type of a solution. And of course, there are a lot of agencies out there that provide material support so that in the future, after the child is born, availability of baby food and diapers and so on. All of that is so important and wonderful. It's something that all of us should be able to get behind, kind of for the crisis pregnancy situation. That work is truly, the work of the angels. We need to support that every opportunity we get.
Yes. And for some moms who may find it difficult to raise that baby, even though, as you mentioned, that is obviously that was their egg, so that's their baby. But some moms may have difficulty with that, and there we have the beautiful gift of adoption, where the baby can be placed for adoption and raised by a different family if the mom just doesn't feel that she can raise that baby, if she discerns that she can't. There are obviously very compassionate ways where you give life to this baby, and if you can't raise the baby, some other family can raise that baby and love that baby. And so abortion should never be considered, because obviously it snuffs out the life of this child who is also a victim of these sexual assaults.
And as you're aware, the many couples yearn to adopt, and they get in line. It's a long line sometimes, and they can't many times successfully find a child for adoption. And so you're right that the mother could decide and determine and realize this may be the best both for her and for the child, although giving up a newborn is difficult. I mean, the bonding that occurs is very deep between mother and child. So I think, this has to be done also with a certain type of circumspection and care to be sure that the young woman, that it's not too difficult for her as a new mother to suddenly have to surrender her child. But again, that's where the supportive family environment, and if this is sort of made as a decision together with the rest of the family, uh, then many times this can be a very happy outcome for everyone, including for the child, as the child has a more supportive, better environment than he or she might have had they not been adopted. So it's a great thing. I myself have two uh, twin sisters, but then uh, my parents adopted two more sisters from Mexico after their parents died.
Mm.
And just speaking from firsthand experience, I can say what a blessing it was, for us to have. So I had four sisters, and I often say now I'm blessed among women. But really, the adoption option or possibility does need to be thought through and looked at for the benefit of all parties who are affected.
Beautiful. Before we talk about the life and health of the mother issues, I think it would be good to lay the groundwork by reminding our listeners about the principle of double effect. So, can you explain the principle of double effect and why it is central to understanding cases, as we will discuss about the life and health of the mother?
Well, principle of double effect, I mean, the term double effect, right? There's two effects. That's really important to keep in mind. So you have one action and it's a double effect. And the reason you need the principle is sometimes you do something and there is that double effect, but one effect is good, but the other effect appears to be bad. And therefore you have to ask yourself, all right, can I do this action when I foresee that there will be two effects, one good, one bad? So the principle of double effect allows you to figure out whether it's okay to do the action that will cause a good and a bad effect or not. And the answer to that is going to be, it depends. So what does it depend on? Well, it depends on some of the criteria that are part and parcel of the principle itself. And this is a very ancient principle. It goes all the way back to probably the 1500s. It's been discussed, by many in the church and many moral theologians and St. Thomas Aquinas and others. It's a very illuminating and important principle, I think, for us to share and to be aware of ourselves. So, what are the requirements in order to satisfy the principle of double effect and be able to say, yes, therefore we can do a particular action which has two effects, one good, one bad? First, the action that you're talking about can't be intrinsically evil. It has to be either morally neutral or a good action, preferably. Now, when we're talking about two effects, one good, one bad, well, the good effect cannot arise out of the bad effect. Why not? Because then we would be using evil means to achieve a good effect, to justify. You'd be using good ends to justify evil means. Now, these two effects that come about, one good, one bad, they do need to be in proportion to each other. They need to have the sort of same weight or gravity. And when it comes to the matter of what are we intending here, what is our intention, we can only intend the good effect and tolerate. That's the key word, tolerate. We recognize it will happen, the bad effect, and we tolerate it. We don't desire it, we don't will it, we don't want it, but we recognize that it will accrue in the wake of doing the original action with two effects. And then, of course, you have to rule out other alternatives here. Make sure that you don't have a way of doing this good action where you only get the good effect and the bad effect does not pop up, does not make itself manifest. Because if you had another way to do the good action and get the good effect, you'd have to do that without getting the bad effect if you could. So that's sort of, in the abstract, the principle of double effect. And, these difficult pregnancy cases sometimes fall under this. But also, it's worth mentioning that double effect is very important in, for example, wartime, uh, when you've declared war against a foreign country, and maybe you've identified a particular military target where they are, let's say, manufacturing weapons, new tanks or missiles that they are then using to attack you, and you decide, well, we're going to bomb that facility. Well, it turns out that there's a number of houses nearby with innocent people close by, and you face the question, well, if we bomb that manufacturing plant, some of those people in the nearby houses may be killed or seriously injured. Is this allowable? And again, you go through all the requirements of the principle of double effect, and there will be some circumstances whereas your modality of self-defense, principle of double effect, will apply, and you will be able to carry out the bombing in a morally acceptable fashion. So double effect is not just for complex pregnancies. It affects, a lot of areas of moral analysis, and even end-of-life settings where you're facing questions of using very high doses of something like morphine to remediate the pain of the individual, and you're worried that as the pain is getting worse and worse and they're getting closer and closer to death, that if you give them more morphine, at some point the morphine itself may affect the ability of the individual to breathe, and as a second unintended effect of controlling their pain, they will lose the ability to take a breath and die as a consequence of the high dose of morphine or other opioid that you may be using. Again, double effect in some circumstances will allow for the continued use, assuming all these requirements that we mentioned are satisfied, which they sometimes can be. So, those are, maybe let me just give you a quick example, one that's used kind of classically when moralists teach about double effect. If you have a woman who gets pregnant and she has the baby growing in her womb, but at the same time, unfortunately, she gets a really, really bad case of endometrial cancer. So there's this ginormous tumor now, let's say, growing in the wall of her uterus. And this tumor is growing really fast. The baby is also growing on the other side of the uterus. But the question becomes, okay, we cannot control this cancer. We've tried chemo, we've tried radiation, and this tumor is galloping and is likely to take over and kill this woman in short order unless we do a hysterectomy, remove the uterus, which contains this giant tumor, but it also contains the growing baby. So is this going to be allowable? So again, as long as these requirements are satisfied, and just, very briefly, is the action itself that we're doing of removing her uterus, is it good or indifferent? You have to say, yeah. I mean, you're removing the cancerous threat. This is directly therapeutic. And secondly, notice that what you're doing is on the body of the mother. You're not, for example, going in and attacking the baby. You're not carving up the baby like they sometimes do in an abortion. You're not attacking the body person of the little baby. And then the question is the good effect not from the bad. That's clearly true. The child dying after you do the hysterectomy is not what is curing the mom. The death of the child doesn't cure the mother of the cancer. What cures her of the cancer is the removal of the tumor through the hysterectomy. And then, is there a proportion? Yes, because if you don't do something with this galloping cancer, both mom and baby are going to die. So you have life of the mom against life of the baby. So there's clearly a proportion between the good and bad effects if you do the hysterectomy. Is our intention only towards the good effect? You have to say, yeah, that's got to be the case. Because what if the person who's doing this hysterectomy, has a side job that they're an abortionist and they're like, yeah, I want to see this baby die. Well, that intention is strongly disordered, and the action by that surgeon would then become disordered and wrong if he was intending and really wanting to see the death of the child. So you only, as we said earlier, you tolerate the fact that when you take out her uterus and the baby is inside, that the baby will thereafter end up dying. And again, you got to be sure you ruled out those other possibilities, which we said we did. No chemo. There's no way to surgically resect this tumor that's in the wall of the uterus. Um, Nothing works here. So you're sort of in a situation with no other possible resolution, and therefore the hysterectomy indeed could be morally allowable by the principle of double effect. So that's just to give a concrete example of applying double effect.
I think that's very helpful. So to sum up, you have to have a good action, either good or morally neutral action, a good or morally neutral intention, good or morally neutral means, circumstance, and that the action itself has to be in proportion with the outcome. Is that correct?
Uh, the action itself has to be in proportion with the outcome. Well, the proportion is not with the action itself. The proportion is between the good effect and the bad effect that follow. And there does need to be a proportion between those two. Otherwise, there would be a danger that one was acting to do something that had a very bad effect without a proportionately serious reason to motivate the original action. And indeed, as you said, the action itself has to be good or morally neutral. And generally, in medicine, we're talking about, is it therapeutic in some way? Because we want to say, yeah, we can do therapy, but the therapy may have a side effect, an unintended, unfortunate bad effect as well. And we can sometimes tolerate that bad effect depending on the details of the case.
Yes. And before we dive into some more examples of life of the mother cases, let's talk a little bit more about intention. So many people assume that intention doesn't matter in medicine, that outcomes are all that count. So can you explain why moral intention does matter when physicians are making life and death decisions?
Yeah, because if your intention is an evil intention, then the very act that you're doing is itself becomes evil and disordered. So our intentions do need to be directed to the good, truly, and require purification because, intentions, I think one of our greatest capabilities as humans is the capability to deceive ourselves. And we'll say things like, well, my intentions are good, and, so I'm going to commit this act of adultery because I have good intentions here. Whatever they are, and they can give you a list of whatever those justifications might be. And we tend to do that. We tend to even become skilled in deceiving ourselves and deceiving others about what our intentions are. And the idea being that, well, if my intentions are good, then it doesn't matter whether I do some other damage along the way, or even if the act itself is something that's, as we say, intrinsically disordered, that it can never be done. Well, it does matter. It actually does matter profoundly. So intentions cannot sanitize these disordered acts. And a lot of people think that intentions can. So we have to, I think, push back very clearly and say, no, the intentions are part of the total moral analysis, but there are other realities that are very much at stake as well.
And I wanted to clarify too that it could go in either direction. Some people will say that intentions don't matter, only the outcome does. But there are others who will say intentions are the only things that matter. And as you mentioned, a good intention itself is not enough just by itself, because you can have a good intention and a bad action. So it's important that the good intentions align with all the other good components, the good actions, the good means, and the good circumstances.
And I
Uh,
think you're right that a lot of people will tend to say, well, but the outcome, so going back to that example with the baby in the womb and the growing tumor, large cancer tumor, that's also growing in the other part of the womb, people say, well, gee, if you do the hysterectomy, the outcome is that you end up with a dead baby. There's no, that's the outcome. So if that's the outcome and you end up with a dead baby, what would be wrong with, going in and just killing the baby directly if it would, help the mother in some fashion? And if that would allow us, to take some other direction in treating her cancer. So, the baby's going to end up dead either way. If we do an abortion, a direct abortion, or if if it's indirect loss of the life of the baby, as occurs when you do the hysterectomy, baby's dead either way, they say. The outcome is the same, and therefore, we don't need to be particularly worked up or worried about doing an abortion. And it's like, no, you've missed key element here, which is in one case, I am myself becoming, as the abortionist, one who is choosing to directly attack vulnerable, precious human life for some other purpose, some other benefit that I hope may follow, whatever that may be, and so it is important to clarify in that situation when you are doing an intervention that has an indirect effect, that you are not choosing in that fashion, the fashion of a direct attack. You are doing a directly therapeutic treatment, the hysterectomy, to take out the cancer that's inside the womb. And as you do it, you're tolerating, you're accepting, you recognize there's not another alternative here, that the child will perish. So the outcome can appear to be the same, but the way you got to the final state is incredibly different and incredibly important. In one case, you targeted a helpless young human being, and in the other, you did not target them. You targeted the cancer, and in targeting the cancer, you tolerated, allowably, that there would be this unfortunate side effect, this loss of life of the child. So these are very different, and people struggle to see this, because as you said correctly, they focus on outcomes. Baby's dead either way. It's like, yeah, but how the baby got dead makes all the difference in the world. And as ethicists, we emphasize that, and as people of good conscience, we need to be in tune with that. The way that the death comes about is very substantive and important.
mhm. Absolutely. Many people will say that the pro-life position, quote unquote, means letting women die. Why is that a misunderstanding of Catholic bioethics?
Letting women die, especially in cases of complex pregnancies, right? Is that what you're
Right,
referring to?
right.
Yeah, yeah. Um, no, I think that the reason that's incorrect is that the implication is that you're not allowed to choose a therapy for a pregnant woman. But we just showed by our previous example that's false. Of course, we can choose therapies. Now, we have to be careful how we choose them, make sure that they're genuinely therapeutic and for the benefit of and the safety of the mother, and sometimes tolerate the second unintended, undesired effect of the loss of the child's life. So we don't have to, in a sense, stand by idly and allow, as some of those people would say, for women to die, if there is, in fact, a valid therapeutic way to treat their condition. And I don't know if you want to talk about the infected membranes case, because that's a good one that I think points to this. So when woman's water breaks, there's a danger that the membranes that are surrounding the baby the sac will get infected. And if the infection happens, then you have this issue, oh dear, so now she's infected. Both mom and baby could die, could perish. And people will say, well, what doctors will sometimes recommend is, oh, well, let's stop the pregnancy. Let's go in and cause an abortion. Let's do a dilation and evacuation, or a D&C, a dilation and curettage, where we actually attack the baby and remove him piecemeal from the uterus. And as we do that, we'll be clearing out other aspects of the infection, and hopefully the woman will do okay. That's the kind of claim that's offered. But that does involve mounting a direct attack on the baby to do the D&E or the D&C. And what's the alternative? Is there a treatment that can be done that goes right for the infection? Well, obviously, if there's an infection early, you do want to try antibiotics, but sometimes that may not work. And if you've gotten to the point that the antibiotics don't stop the infection after her water breaks and after the membranes are known to be infected, her temperature is rising, then you can look at what's called an early induction of labor. So why would you do that? Well, because you're trying to expel the infected membranes and prevent the infection from becoming septic, as we call it, where it just takes over her whole body and rapidly kills both mom and baby. So you can induce labor early using certain particular drugs like Pitocin, and then those membranes will be expelled, but so will the baby, and the baby will then no longer have a means of support or connection to his or her mom, so the baby will perish as well. And that's similar to the earlier case that we looked at. We tolerate the unintended secondary effect in our efforts to provide therapy to mom for a serious fulminating infection. And we've ruled out that there's no other possibilities available to control her infection. And this appears to be a measure of last order, as it were. So, there are many similar situations where you have conflict between mom and baby, apparent conflicts that may require treatment for the mom, where the baby will end up either damaged, physically hurt, or dying, in fact. You can think of another example, that case that I mentioned earlier, of the big cancer tumor growing in the uterus and the baby growing inside the same uterus, maybe on the other side of the uterus. And the doctor can say, well, we actually have a new chemotherapy or maybe an immunotherapy that we believe has like 85 to 90% chance that it'll shrink that tumor. It's like, oh, okay, that's good. But we also realize that if we give mom this immunotherapy or this chemotherapy, the baby may end up with birth defects. So everybody gets, kind of apoplectic and says, well, then we need to kill the baby first, etc., do an abortion. But the reality is, it may indeed be allowable to provide the chemotherapeutic or the immunotherapy and tolerate that the child will have some damage, some birth defect, some issue that hopefully after he or she is born, we can continue to assist the baby, maybe do some surgeries that'll address the birth defect, whatever it is, if it were like cleft palate or whatever. So again, this idea that we just have to stand by and watch mom die is, of course, this emotional oversimplification that kind of scores points for the pro-abortion cause. And we have to say, hey, that's not even coherent. Let's think about this from the proper medical angle.
And what if someone just listening to this is saying, well, it sounds like it's the same thing. You're doing an early induction, you're emptying the uterus, the baby's dying. Can you bring this back around to not only the principles we discussed, which is the intention and the act itself, to just really clarify the difference when you take an action like that, the difference between uh, doing something that's therapeutic for the mom with and the principle of double effect versus having doing something that directly attacks the baby.
Yeah, so as we said previously, the way that the baby ends up dying is hugely important. And anytime we make an intentional decision that I am going to be master directly over the life and mount a direct attack against the body person of the child and make the child into a victim of mine directly by going in with a scalpel and cutting up the child, for example, that crosses a fundamental moral line. And we can never do that. We can never say, you know, for the good of mom or for the good of someone else, we're going to go in and we're going to directly kill someone else. You know, I can't choose to kill some member of your family if it would benefit you for some reason. I just can't do that. You know, no matter what the reason is and how strongly somebody might feel, oh, I should be able to kill one of, you know, Irina's relatives to bring some benefit to Irina. That's crossing a fundamental line. But if I, you know, offer you some kind of medical treatment that you need, and somehow there were to be some side effects from that that affected other members of your family, you know, the treatment that you received for a particular disease made you so sick that now your family members had to care for you and be bedside. That's a whole different, that's an indirect uh, imposition of burden onto the family. And again, you can see by double effect that that makes sense and is allowable in appropriate circumstances. So I think here it is hard for people when you're saying, well, the child will die anyway, to realize how important it is. The way that the child dies is everything. And we cannot ever make a decision to instrumentalize, that's the fancy word that we use, to instrumentalize the good of the child for the mom. But we can, if she has a valid medical condition, opt to treat her. That is always going to be a genuine therapeutic effort that is allowable, and there will be some circumstances where the effect, secondary effect, may even be a fairly serious one, like the loss of the life of the child. Or, as we said earlier, the child may have a birth defect or something, depending on what we do. But that, again, ruling out alternatives may, at times, sometimes, be permissible, depending on the particulars of the case.
And another case that we've encountered in these types of debates is ectopic pregnancies. And ectopic pregnancy is often used as a gotcha question in these abortion debates. What actually medically happens during an ectopic pregnancy?
Well, so the embryo is making its way. The fertilization, most of us came into existence in the fallopian tubes of our moms. That's where we originated as embryos, but then those embryos, inside the fallopian tube, you have these little hairs called fimbri, and they kind of wave with the wind, and they move the embryo down towards the uterus, and then the embryo tries to implant himself or herself into the uterine wall. But sometimes that journey, you know, down the fallopian tube, the embryo may somehow get stuck and implant himself or herself into the fallopian tube wall. Now, the fallopian tube is really pretty thin by comparison to the uterus. So this can't work. You can't have a complete pregnancy develop with you sitting in your mom's fallopian tube. And if that happens, if it starts to grow, the fallopian tube stretches, gets bigger and bigger, then there's a danger of rupture and massive hemorrhage or bleeding, and then death potentially of both mom and the baby. So these are potentially very emergency types of situations. And so the question becomes, well, what can we do? What's allowable? I mean, are we allowed to go into the mother's pelvis and where the baby is in the tube, are we allowed to cut into the tube and then cut up the baby or scoop out the baby and end the pregnancy, so cause an abortion, or not? That's called a salpingostomy. And that raises problems that you are attacking the body person of the baby if you do that directly, for the benefit of the mother, admittedly, but it does not appear to be a therapeutic action on the body person of mom. So that's the problem. Now, is there any other approach that could be taken? Well, there is indeed, and what is really the morally acceptable path, again, circumstances permitting, would be to recognize that that embryo, that baby growing inside the tube, that it has caused a pathological situation to arise. The tube cannot support that pregnancy. The lining of the tube is growing aberrantly, and therefore, since that part of the tube has become pathological, you may remove it, recognizing that the baby is inside. This is similar to what we said when the baby and the cancer tumor were in the uterus, and we do a hysterectomy. We remove the whole uterus with the baby inside. This is similar. You cut both sides of the fallopian tube with the baby inside, and the rest of the placenta where it's attached to the wall of the fallopian tube. Take it out, and then you try to reconnect both ends of the tube. Sometimes you can do that successfully, but not always, because it depends how much damage was done by the ectopic growth. And when you take it out, then you tolerate the loss of the child's life as a second effect, but it's a genuine therapeutic intervention where you've resolved the ectopic situation and not through a direct attack on the child. Now, people again will say, like you said before, oh, well, the baby ends up dead. Seems like it's not much different than if you did the salpingostomy. You went in there and you scooped out the baby and, pulled it out in pieces with forceps. That doesn't seem much different. The mom's life is saved. Well, it is different. It's profoundly different. In one case, you're, again, instrumentalizing the baby and his or her integrity for the benefit of the mother, while in the other case, you are removing clear area of pathological growth, which is, yes, secondary to the child's presence, but it's clearly pathological, and the intervention is itself therapeutic, and therefore is not going to raise these problems of a direct attack. It's always going to constitute an indirect effect that the child will die when you do that treatment of the ectopic. So that's, very similar. You can see how the principles sort of apply based on the particulars of the medical anomaly that you're facing.
Right. And the reason it's pathological is that those little hairs that are supposed to push down the embryo from within the fallopian tube are not doing their job. So there's a pathological situation there where the body and especially the fallopian tube is not doing what it should be in bringing that
And more,
baby, moving
and
that
more
baby
than
along.
that, more than that, the placental tissues called the trophoblast are working vigorously to attach the baby in the wrong place, in the tube rather than in the uterus. So this gets very complicated. You get, the sort of generation of very complex connections from the baby to the mom's body, in this case, in the wrong place. And it can only go so far. And this becomes, very large, very pathological, because the tube is not set up to hold a pregnancy like that for 9 months. It's not set up. So in most cases, if that continues, you're going to indeed face the danger of rupture. Baby gets bigger and bigger. The tube is really, really tiny when you start out. It's getting stretched, bigger and bigger, and then it bursts. And that's really, really dangerous. So
Right.
it's clearly pathological on a number of levels.
And before a couple decides, well, we should go ahead with having that fallopian tube, that section of the fallopian tube removed. Can you talk a little bit about doing the watchful waiting? How often do pregnancies, ectopic pregnancies, end up resolving by themselves without interventions?
So it does happen. It's not, I would say it's not super common, but it does happen. And so the expectant management, or as you called it, watchful waiting, is definitely to be counseled, and good OBGYN will recommend that so that you monitor how the pregnancy is going, usually by ultrasound, and you watch because sometimes the baby, because it's in such a out of the ordinary place, baby won't be able to do well, and the baby will die spontaneously in that fallopian tube, and sometimes even be extruded, as now a deceased child and tissue, extruded into the uterus and lost. And if that happens, there's not an issue. Now, also, if you have good monitoring equipment and you're assessing and you have the child growing in the fallopian tube and you've got a heartbeat and good signal to noise ratio, and at a certain point you realize, wow, the heart has stopped. The child died. Then, is it okay to go in by surgically and remove the body of the deceased child? Yes, and that is not an abortion. That is simply removal of the corpse, as it were, the little baby's body after he or she died. And of course, that's permissible again, to bring about a benefit to the mom. And you do want to do that, because if you don't do that, there's a danger that actually some of these ectopics, if left in place, even after the child dies, could become cancerous.
Mm-hmm. And also, another method that is often used in hospitals is injecting the mother into the muscles with methotrexate, which basically poisons the child. And so the baby dies because he or she's been poisoned. Why is the use of methotrexate not allowable ethically?
Well, it appears, and there seems to be in some quarters a little bit of debate around this, although I'm not sure how much latitude for legitimate debate there is. But some people have tried to argue that methotrexate may have some indirect mechanism of action, that it's affecting supportive tissues and not directly attacking the child. But if you assess really how it works, it affects DNA replication, and rapidly dividing tissues will be affected by methotrexate. And so, it does, for all intents and purposes, appear to constitute a direct attack, again, on the body person of the child, and therefore not a legitimate, it's just another form of potentially inducing an abortion. And we don't want that to be part of our toolbox here of how we handle these ectopics, especially when we have the alternative, the salpingectomy, which is the cutting of the tube on both sides, and the removal of the pathological situation, and the reanastomosing or reconnecting of the ends. So methotrexate, I know there are some voices, even in Catholic healthcare here and there, that you'll encounter, who will try to argue that it is justifiable and allowable. But I think to me, personally, it strikes me as a very tenuous, troublesome line of argument to try to sustain that. And I think it doesn't ultimately work as a coherent approach to the ectopic pregnancy, but appears not to be indirect, but a direct attack. So,
Mm-hmm. And so to sum up, ethical options are watchful waiting, or expectant management. If the baby dies on his own, his or her own, dies on his or her own way, then you are allowed to go in there and remove the corpse of that baby, or as a last resort, to cut the fallopian tube where that baby has implanted. But what's not allowed, according to Catholic ethics, is the use of methotrexate or to directly kill and remove the embryo from the fallopian tube. Is that correct?
Yeah, to directly kill and remove the embryo would not be allowable, because then we would be using someone else as a means to an end. Their very life and integrity would be attacked to help someone else. And so that's something we should never opt for. It's a failure of medicine to treat both of the patients who are caught in this awkward moment of the ectopic pregnancy.
In 1917, Dr. C.J. Wallace reported in the Surgery, Gynecology, and Obstetrics Journal a rare case of a successful surgical relocation of an ectopic pregnancy into the uterus, resulting in a full-term normal delivery and a live birth of a child. What do you think about this case? And if it was done in 1917, why can't we do it today? How close are we to being able to do this again today?
I think there's a lot of skepticism surrounding the claim that he actually did it. And it's understandable why there's skepticism when you have an embryo growing ectopically. You know, it doesn't just have to be in the fallopian tube. Sometimes you get embryos that attach to a liver or some other organ or somewhere else in the peritoneum. And this sort of growth of the placental tissue and the attachment point, this is a very complex interface between mom and baby that we don't really understand all the physiology of it. There's a lot of work, good work going on to try to understand it, but we've got a ways to go. So this idea that you could just sort of pull this out and place it into the uterus seems very unlikely, because you're going to be ripping apart important points of connection between mom and baby, and then hoping all those connections are going to somehow almost magically re-establish themselves once you go into the uterus. Now, some of these approaches that you're describing from 1917 or other attempts that were made later, they will sort of punch a hole into the wall of the uterus with a knife and then place the baby in there with some of the, accompanying placental tissue. They're hoping then that the sort of blood and so on that surrounds that will trigger better possibilities for reconnection. But it seems that this has not been verified enough. And frankly, my belief is, if this is real, if this were real back in 1917 or in any other human cases, we ought to be able to do this in animal models. And that's where we should be focusing our attention. And there is some good research that's happening there. And I'm hopeful that the animal models, the animal research, we call this preclinical data, will become more and more robust with time. And that in the future, maybe 20 years in the future, it will be possible to do something like this, that we'll know the conditions, we'll have worked it all out in the preclinical setting with the animals, and then we can just do it in humans as well and save the life of both mom and her baby. What a beautiful thing. So good research needs to continue in this direction. And I'm actually kind of hopeful. I know I saw a paper a couple of years ago that suggested, real progress being made in that direction. So, but still a ways to go, I think.
Shouldn't we at least try to relocate the embryo? Let's say that you already have a woman who has an ectopic pregnancy, her fallopian tube has been cut. Could she request, even if it's experimental, that then that they try to relocate the baby into the uterus at that point?
I don't think so. If you don't have sufficient corroborating data to make you believe that this actually has a reasonable probability of working, then it becomes, you're going to hey, I want you to experiment on my kid. I want you to do experiments on my kid. Now, on what grounds? Yeah, you're going to say, well, there might theoretically, but I mean, if the risks here are known to be high, which they are, then on what grounds are you going to be subjecting this child to high risk, high probability of mortality? I don't think the risk, the benefit to risk, benefit to burden ratio would in fact allow for that kind of thing. Just to do some experiment where we have no data, no corroborating indications beyond one report in 1917, and we're not even sure that that one was legit, I would say no, that should not be. And I think most medical centers would decline, and rightly decline. But once we have more corroborating data, and we can really lean firmly on some outcomes that have been assessed, and the methodology has been streamlined so that we know exactly what the steps were in preparation for moving the baby, moving the embryo from the tube to the uterus, and we can replicate those conditions faithfully in humans, great, then I'd say yes, then that's the time to move forward. But not ahead of that, not by just doing some kind of experiment and treating, because the very act of removing the child out of the tube may be a death-dealing act if it's done too willy-nilly without appropriate preparations. Even though the intention there is good, it may be a sterling intention. Hey, we want both mom and baby to survive the ectopic. That's not enough. We need to have, I think, more supportive and corroborating data.
And hopefully, as you mentioned, in 20 years or maybe less, we can do that.
Yeah.
But obviously, when you cut the fallopian tube, there's a 100% chance that baby will die as a result. And so the thought is, perhaps once we're able or have more information about how to do this, instead of having a 100% chance that the baby will die, just trying something that is experimental, that has shown at least some chance of success, would be worth trying if the mother is willing to undergo that, just to see if she could save the baby. But
Yeah, and
obviously,
if
as
the
you mentioned,
probabilities are reasonable that this could be therapeutic, because you want to do something that's therapeutic, not something that's just raw, generic experimentation on vulnerable subjects.
right, right. Now let's pivot to some philosophical questions as we're nearing the end of the interviews process here. If the unborn child is a human being, which of course we know the unborn child is, why does that fact change the ethical analysis in all of these cases?
Because we have a general requirement for justice. And what does justice mean? It means that if you have several human beings in front of you, that they all deserve to be treated under the heading of the same rubric. They have an equality of being that deserves respect. So just because one of those human beings is smaller than the other, or younger, or older than the other, should not allow us to be biased. So justice, the demands of justice are fundamentally at play in making these ethical assessments.
Mm-hmm. And how does recognizing the inherent dignity of every human life shape the way medicine approaches suffering?
Well, the inherent dignity of every human being does have to be presupposed in order to have a coherent way of dealing with situations of suffering that arise, because otherwise this is on the other end of the life spectrum, but you may get to what's happening now very noticeably, for example, in Canada, where we have suffering at the end of life, and people saying, oh, well, we're going to open up a glide path for you to commit suicide, and we're going to actually help you commit that suicide. And that's a failure to respect who that person is. When we're cooperating in the evil of suicide, we're trying to redefine suicide now as something that's good. or allowable. So the inherent dignity, recognizing that of all people, people whether they're sick, whether they're suffering, and especially people who are disabled. You know, it's interesting that those who have disabilities are some of the strongest opponents to physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. They're like, hey, I've got a target on my back. I don't want that. I don't want this to be legalized. Good heavens, they're going to be telling me that I have to make an early exit because I'm in a wheelchair, or I use a walker, or you know, whatever my disability happens to be. So, yes, there's an inherent dignity that pervades, and we must all work with all our hearts to see it, to be in tune with it, and to safeguard it at every turn. And, you know, this is an area, you know, since we've been talking about early life issues a lot on this podcast, a lot of couples, I think, need to do some soul searching when they get married and say to each other, well, if the Lord sends us a child and the child is missing an arm, or the child has some terrible genetic ailment, are we willing to accept and embrace and receive with open arms whatever life the Lord sends us? I think a lot of couples would honestly have, oh no, I have my quality, I have my standards, I have my quality that I expect. God has to send us what we want, and if he doesn't, then I'm sorry, we're just not going to accept that gift. We're going to reject the gift. And that's a terrible stance for us to take, but our society has conditioned young people many times to think that way. And so that inherent dignity that you were referring to, we've got to all the time ponder deeply, philosophically, personally, for myself, if it were to happen, you know, if I got married and had a kid this way, could I accept whoever the Lord in his goodness sent our way? Down syndrome, whatever, you know. And the mystery of that this is not just about me, this is about bigger design, and that the Lord clearly knows what he's doing. He is the Lord of life, life itself. So, yeah, I think that's a challenge that remains and stands in the backdrop of many anti-life decisions that get made.
Yes, and I think that human dignity is most often at risk with vulnerable people because the most vulnerable in our society, whether it's the preborn or people with disabilities, are the most at risk when it comes to these types of decisions.
Sure seems that way.
What would you say to physicians who feel enormous moral pressure to commit abortions in difficult cases?
Yeah, I think there are, you know, there's this problem that when you're a physician, sometimes you get trained in various procedures. And it's like, okay, and pretty soon as a physician, you sort of, oh, I got this tool, this hammer, for example. So every situation looks like a nail, and I should be able to, you know, hit the nail with my hammer. And because I don't want to do nothing, that's often the feeling as a physician. I don't want my patient to have no options, sort of thing. And I think there needs to be a certain, I'd call it maybe a therapeutic humility, that sometimes the circumstances escape our control. And as a physician, that's hard, but we need to, again, work through that and say, yeah, I'm not going to be able to fix everything. My hammer is not going to work in every case. And everything is not a nail, and I have to be, I'll do what I can, I'll make reasonable choices, I will help my patients, but I will never turn on my heel and become a killer of my patients. I simply will not do that. I will, you know, healers cannot be killers. And I will be a true healer. I will be faithful to my art and to my patient. Otherwise, I am going to be bundled up into a kind of raw and pure contradiction that, you know, will be damaging and damning in the final analysis to who I am as a human being. So I think physicians do need to reflect on those aspects and on the fact that they're limited And even with very sophisticated and impressive modalities for addressing diseases, there are some times when we're not going to be able to do it. And if you ever think that you have to kill somebody to help somebody else, you better stop and think twice about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to a woman who is standing in front of you and she is pregnant by rape, incest, or has a life-threatening condition during her pregnancy?
I think I would want to discuss with her many of the issues that you and I discussed on this podcast. What are you thinking about in the wake of the sexual assault? What have you done up to this point? How can we be of assistance to you in the journey that lies ahead, etc. I think that's what I would counsel.
Mm-hmm. And what gives you hope that medicine can remain faithful to the dignity of both mother and child?
Well, I think I'm always encouraged by groups like the Catholic Medical Association, the CMA, where you have physicians who come together for meetings and they give a witness, and then they're maybe in a workplace that's a secular environment, but everybody sort of knows, oh, that's the Catholic doc over there. I have a friend of mine who's a physician in Florida, and he worked for probably 40 years in the ICU. And he just kind of got to be known as, the Catholic guy, and if people had dilemmas, they would come to him, and he gave beautiful, powerful witness. So I'm hopeful that when we have people like that, who really believe in the mission of healing that is at the core of medicine, that gets transmitted. And I think you have young people coming into medicine who are idealistic. They're like, yeah, this is important. Yeah, I really do care about my patients. And I'm not going to go down some of these dark alleys that offer themselves as temptations. I'm going to really love my patients, do good by them, and not treat any of them as targets for harmful, direct attack.
Mm-hmm. And finally, if listeners remember only one thing about these hard cases, what would it be?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if one can say if there's only one thing to remember. There's probably not one thing. This is what we're probably approaching close to 2 hours here. And one understands there's nuance. So I guess if I had to try to reduce, I'd say, let's discuss the particulars. The details will matter, and let's make sure that we clarify what are the goods that are really at stake. Let's do that. That's sometimes something we want to brush under the rug. No, let's not brush it under the rug. Let's be forthright and direct and supportive of each other so that we can provide real, authentic healing.
Well, thank you, Father Tad, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. You are one of the best, if not the best, in the field of bioethics and Catholic bioethics.
Oh, you're very kind, Irina. Thank you so much. Really pleasure to join you.
Yes, and these are hard questions, and you are well equipped to answer them so that our audience can understand what's at stake. And for anyone interested in learning more about the National Catholic Bioethics Center or what Father Tad is doing, please see ncbcenter.org and fathertad.com. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you as well, Irina. God bless you, and God bless all your listeners.
For my conversation with Father Tadeusz Pacholczyk, a priest, Yale and Harvard-trained scientist, and senior ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, here are my 5 key takeaways on the hard cases in the abortion debate involving rape, incest, and life of the mother. 1. The hard cases are rare, but strategically dominate the debate. Rape, incest, and the life of the mother scenarios make up a very small percentage of abortions, yet they are often used to shape public opinion and policy. Father Tad explains that these cases are frequently leveraged emotionally to open the door to broader acceptance of abortion. 2. Emotional reactions cannot replace ethical reasoning. These cases are deeply tragic, but bioethics insists that feelings alone are not enough to determine what is right. Father Tad warns against substituting emotional responses for careful moral analysis, noting that serious ethical questions require objective reasoning, not just sentiment. 3. There are always two patients, mother and child. A foundational principle in bioethics is that both the mother and the preborn child are patients deserving care, dignity, and moral consideration. Ignoring the child or treating the child as expendable is, in his view, a failure of ethical reasoning. 4. The difference between direct and indirect actions is everything. In complex medical cases, especially involving the life of the mother, the key ethical distinction is directly intending the death of the child is never permissible. Treating a serious condition in the mother, even if the child dies as an unintended effect, may be permissible. This is governed by the principle of double effect, where intention, action, and means, not just outcomes, matter. 5. Abortion does not resolve trauma, it can compound it. In cases like rape or incest, Father Tad emphasizes that abortion is often presented as a solution, but may instead add a second layer of trauma. He argues that both mother and child are victims, and that true care means supporting both rather than responding to the violence against the mother with another act of violence against the child. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is Bioethics Babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.